Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Sven Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, is a technological society possible without bureaucracy? Now, you might want to think, well, okay, what am I going on about here? What is bureaucracy? Because you could define it in lots of different ways. What is it about technological society and bureaucracy? Well, I can't remember what stimulated this, but I remember reading Ted Kaczynski in the Industrial Society and Its Enemies, I think it's called. He makes quite an interesting observation that as society develops, technologically speaking, there seems to be sort of more rules imposed upon you than would exist in a pre-industrial society. So one example he uses is, well, back in the day, you just walk where you want. That's fine. But now there's cars everywhere. And then, we need a system to organize the cars and have a set of rules to be able to make that function without people crashing into each other. And then you, as someone who wants to walk from A to B, well, now you've got to go to the intersection. You got to press a button. You got to go across to regulate because where the cars are going and it's getting in the way of where you're walking. And so you have this sort of big sort of system with lots of intertwined rules, which are sort of imposed, as he would say, on the individual. Similarly, he makes the case that if you are to have large industrial society, what you're going to require is lots of standardization and consolidation of organization so that people can deal with each other. So one of the arguments, for instance, for things like the European Union is regulation harmonization, because what you need is to facilitate international trade is a common set of rules, because this is going to make trading and things easier. And Ted K would probably argue this is just a natural development, because if you have different places with different sets of rules, then it's not going to work. So you can't sort of have your own individual firm or organization doing something one way and another firm doing it another way, because they're not going to be able to deal with each other well. You need to have all these common practices and sort of homogenization of how things kind of operate. And then kind of thought, well, would this happen in Ancapistan? So would you have this sort of level of bureaucracy? Because I think the reflexive sort of libertarian position would be, well, no, of course not. You'd have lots of freedom in Ancapistan. And I was thinking, well, I understand why they say that. But then if you read someone like Bob Murphy, for instance, and a lot of libertarians will say, well, a lot of the roles that the state provides can be sort of taken over by insurance companies. Let's say things like defense contracts, contractors, or anything like that. But if you have any dealings with in insurance companies, at least today, well, they end up being quite pedantic in what is covered and what is not covered in the insurance contract. And a lot of what you might think are stupid rules that firms have and force their employees to follow, and sort of mean that it makes life more difficult for their customers. A lot of it will be down to insurance contract. It's like, well, no, the insurance contract says you can't do this. So for one thing, in England, it's increasingly difficult for anybody under the age of 18 to work anywhere. Now, it's technically legal for them to work from 16, but a lot of the stuff comes down to the insurance contract to say that it's basically not possible to do it unless, I suppose, you pay a massive premium over and above what you would normally pay for this sort of type of insurance, like public liability insurance. So I was thinking, what could a technological society, how could it operate? Would it have to have these sort of rules imposed? Now you might think, imposed by whom and what are they and what counts as bureaucracy? So I had to think about this, and Tim, he had a to and fro beforehand. And I came up with an idea that bureaucracy it's probably best to find something like this. There's a rule which is created by an individual or a group of people who the person for whom the rule impacts can't directly access that person or those persons, and they have very little control over it. So if you're working in a large corporation, for instance, you'll have a lot of set of rules on how you organize and do things. And you as a low-level employee have basically no control over that whatsoever. And you probably won't be told even why these rules exist. Just the fact that they do exist. And for me as a customer, I mean, lots of internal processes that firms have, I have no control over, but the rules just seem to bind them. So when I was trying to get my dad to switch his cable supplier, I couldn't reorganize an engineer to come because the system simply wouldn't let them. Now, I don't know if eventually I ever spoke to enough people, but I spent ages on the phone to multiple people because it would seem an individual lower down doesn't have the agency to be able to go, oh, I'll just do that. That's fine. Yeah, we'll just sort it out. So that seems to me to be something that at least current technological societies have, that there are these additional rules that people have very little control over, and there are more of them as society becomes more sophisticated. I suppose you could argue to the extent you have more greater levels of division of labor and specialization, these sort of coordinating rules become more complex, and you don't have much control over them as an individual. At least most people don't. So that's, I think, at least Ted K's position. And I think to a large extent, you could argue, to a large extent, that's kind of true, at least of today. So, Tim, do you think my overview to the sort of further bureaucratization, or whatever, for a better phrase, does seem to be what's happened since, say, the Industrial Revolution onwards, irrespective of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing? But do you think at least Ted K's observation is at least true, and this could at least even be true to some extent in sort of Bob Murphy's Ancapistan run by insurance companies world?
As a short answer, I reread Ted K's Industrial Societies and Its Consequences, and I've read it critically for the first time rather than reading sympathetically. And I mean, I in both my critical and my sympathetic reading of it, I think it's descriptively right, or descriptively as right as, I mean, oddly enough, he does come off at times as quote unquote dated in the sense that, like, well, he's dealing with problems of 30, where he's an old man at this point. But I would say it's right. The question is, I mean, I'm not of the position that there are just like neutral, like if you describe reality in a rotten way, in some ways you're making a critique of society whether you like it or not. I mean, I think only a real autistic idiot or something like that. And again, I like autistic people, so I'm not. But like only like a total thick person would say that Ted Kaczynski turned around. Well, I actually like industrial society. You know, I'm just describing it this way. No, he's describing industrial society as a form of tyranny, in my position. In his descriptive statements, marshaled in that manner, by definition, I would argue, is a critique. It's like Hans Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed. If you want to say, well, Hans is just describing democracy. He's not critiquing it. He's just describing it. I mean, the same way with you know, like, and some people to read Marx this way too. Like Marx is just describing capitalism. He's not critiquing it. He's just, you know, that is what it is. So yeah, I agree that your description is right. And Kaczynski's description is right of industrial society. Whether that's a good thing, I think, is the more interesting question, and its origin question, like why this happened, and that does relate to your second question of Bob Murphy. But they're the empirical statements of like they're the things in question. Like are bureaucracies required to have things like roads to begin with? Because like it just seems like when cars come, or which are basically fast horseless carriages, you know, or roads themselves. Like roads don't just exist. Like they're a product of human action in the Misesian framework. Like, Kaczynski will complain about you can't cross a road unless, you follow the rules. But like, there's a highway, there's abandoned roads in the United States. There's abandoned interstate in Pennsylvania. I've ridden a bike on it. You can cross that road. It used to be a 4-lane highway. It's now, you can cross. There's spray paint. There's all sorts of things. There is. Kaczynski could construct his cabin there if he really wanted to. But like, it's not being maintained by anyone, so it's going to fall apart in 20 years. It actually is already starting to. It's kind of a neat tourist attraction, but it's not going to last unless more people maintain them. So like roads are a human artifact. They're not just like so but I would say that's also true of other things, cities. So like the critique of Bob Murphy's thing would be just say, well, our society in Kapistan would be run by, the dispute mechanism would be insurance companies. And to go back to Hans Hoppe has an essay lecture on insurance and probability. And Hoppe will make, this sort of ties a lot of things we've talked about. Like, Hoppe will make the point that, like, this is based on a view of probability, which Mises' brother actually critiqued. Richard von Mises, I think is his name. Like insurance companies, the math, Taleb has critiqued this too. Like the math that healthcare insurance companies use is just a way to justify welfare, which is fine. You could go full like Catholic Workers' Party and just say we should take care of people. But in order to justify that, we have to concoct insurance schemes that are basically welfare transfers. So that does create bureaucracy, but in a sense, the insurance companies operate like a Schmittian Supreme Court. We have to decide what is the law. We have to like take all these competing aims in these human artifacts, and we have to sort of get them into a position. So like, how much money are you owed if you spill coffee on your lap? I actually had this. I took a legal studies class. They went through the McDonald's insurance claim, and then the few arguments that get forgotten is that it was hotter than average coffee for one thing, and number two, a thing that's forgotten is also she wasn't suing them for malice. She was just suing them because she had ruinous healthcare bills. She didn't have insurance. She, the lady, didn't have insurance. It probably wouldn't have happened. This is like Ben Burgess. It wouldn't have happened in a society like Singapore or a society like Canada, which has quote unquote universal healthcare. I know that's going to piss off all the libertarians in Britain and Canada who have horror stories of healthcare. I agree. I'm not a fan, but I would just say insurance companies are kind of like the Supreme Court, where we have to decide what is the law. And Mises himself is interesting in the sense that Mises is an advocate of one world government. That's Todd Lewis's critique of Mises. Hoppe is an advocate of competing dictatorships. But how do you like get those? How do you get harmony? Okay, how do you get harmony without conflict? And I'd say one of the ways to do it is through legal things, but where that meets the road is insurance. Where that meets the road is insurance companies. That's how it gets quote unquote hammered out. Now, there's also, of course, scammers and scuzzy people out there who will use this just as a way to loot people. But that's just a problem to me of human nature. That's not just inept bureaucracy. The problem with COVID, for example, is not bureaucracy. The problem with COVID was there's a group of very powerful people who wanted to loot all sorts of people and used it as an excuse. It was probably created in a lab. It may have actually been purposely released. I'm not to get on the side. Like I don't have this kind of like folksy critique. Like we can ship a package anywhere in the world almost anywhere in the world, any developed city in the world, like basically overnight. That's FedEx, UPS, DHL. They're wonderful bureaucracies. They work. The CIA can kill anybody within reason. Now again, they might make quote unquote mistakes, LL. They can send a missile anywhere in the world. Like, we can do lots of stuff with industrial society. That's what Kaczynski to me misses. Kaczynski misses all the things that, and I would argue all that stuff we can do increase human freedom. Things like all those things increase human freedom. The things that Kaczynski talks about, like, so in Kaczynski's society, you'd have to maintain the primitivist levels. I mean, it's like the ending of Battlestar Galactica of the newer version of the TV show, where you have to like forcibly maintain. It's like you have to forcibly maintain everyone into this primitivist level. You can't, like, you have to be like Luddite. You have to have like a Luddite bureaucracy to maintain this. If Kaczynski's analysis is right in that regard, so that'd be my response. Insurance companies solve the Schmittian problem of human conflict without physical conflict. That'd be my response to it. So that gets in like the root of like what we've been talking about for 5 years. So sorry to be on a tangent.
And I think it's interestingly related. So yeah, I mean the coronavirus stuff is certainly relevant. I suppose the way I'm thinking about it is, suppose it was possible to have a pure sort of or a minarchist or Ancapistan society with minimal crime. How might this look? And you're right when it comes to freedom, because I mean that's always the sort of positive versus negative freedom debate. Because you can argue in one sense we have more. Well, I think freedom is kind of is kind of a difficult term to define. It seems that in certain respects humans have more power now than they did, but they have less power in other ways. Because I think power is probably a easier way of defining it. So we have more power to travel. So if you go back to our old episode on it's like a taxonomy of power, like physical power, it just seems to be what humans now have substantially more physical power than they did. Now I suppose Ted K might say you as an individual doesn't, but I mean you can effectively get somebody as your agent to do something for you, to transform it in such a way that you wouldn't be able to do so on your own. So yeah, that there is that. What I was thinking was, when it comes to rules and internal things, it seems to be a function of scale to a large extent. So if you look at large corporations, those are the ones who have all the procedures and things that they have to follow, quote unquote, have to. Because it's simply a way of controlling lower level employees when the owners have nothing to do directly with the lower level employees. It's a way of maintaining control. And that's why you do it. So that's why the guy you ring up on the phone to, he can't do anything because the computer says no, because they've set it up in such a way that, well, probably so that a low level employee can't just bankrupt the company. Now, there might be other things there as well. But so there definitely just seems to be an issue of scale, and you would on average, the larger the organization, you would expect more sort of rules and regulations that otherwise wouldn't exist. And again, if you're an employee of that organization, you're not going to be able to have any direct control over what those are, unless you're in a manager position. You're supposed to get the Karen, like, I need the manager, because the manager is the only guy who has any discretion. And even that guy might not have that much discretion. With the insurance companies, I certainly think they could be a source of a lot of annoying sort of rules. Also, that said, we mentioned with respect to the law and the and the amount that lady needs to the compensation required for that lady. I mean, it would seem, just as an aside of the legal practice, it would seem to be the case. Well, if they, as it seems like a tort claim, there's no malice intended. It was just, you did all this harm to me, and well, you just need to pay me compensation plus the medical bills. Now, if it happens to be the case that the medical bills happen to be really, really high, I'm kind of thinking, well, that's not in a sense, that's not the woman's fault. That's just, again, like a fact of nature. As an aside, this is something I'm going to say about Ted K. What's interesting with Ted K and a lot of anti-industrialization people is they'll complain about rules imposed by other people, but rules imposed by nature doesn't matter. And actually, those are good. Because interesting, if you could Ted K, but he essay, or whatever you want to call it, his he's kind of pro-evolution as a way of keeping the gene pool in a good condition, because he says that having increased population, keeping people alive, is going to be basically dysgenic, and then you're going to need this big bureaucracy of organizations to have like gene editing and stuff to prevent the genetic stock of the population collapsing. And again, this would require, so technology requires even more technology as its solution. But back to sort of the law point, it does seem to me that a lot of insurance company stuff does seem to be downstream of what seem to me to be utterly absurd legal decisions. My favorite example of these, which you may or may not be aware of, is a famous case in England called the Donahue and Stevenson case, whereby a guy, I can't remember which way around it is, one guy bought ginger beer in a clay bottle, so he couldn't see what's inside it. And he found out it had a snail or a slug inside it. And from this case, judges developed a doctrine of duty of care, saying that there's a duty of care to make sure that it didn't have a slug in it. And the defendant said, well, under the common law, you had the defense of caveat emptor. It was buyer beware. He takes a risk, fine. He doesn't get what he expected. Well, it's the responsibility is kind of on the buyer. Now, both of those could be slightly unreasonable. I mean, it seems to me the obvious thing to respond here is the guy didn't want to buy a ginger beer with a slug in. He knew that he didn't expect that was what he was going to buy. Just give him a refund. That would have been the easiest thing. But since then, you have this doctrine of duty of care, which seems to have permeated absolutely everything, such that I'm pretty sure there's been cases in England whereby householders have had like holes dug in like the garden and they're not like signposted or have something covered over them. And then a burglar comes in and falls in and then sues on the ground of duty of care. And I think they've won. So this expansive doctrine of duty of care seems to have massively influenced what the insurance companies can do. Well, what the policies insurance companies will do, because they want to make sure that they pay out as little as possible. And then, of course, as well, the statute, as I mentioned, when it comes to under 18s working, I'm pretty sure that's down, because about when Gordon Brown was prime minister, this was the late 2000s, he basically tried to increase the school leaving age to 18, but he kind of did it, but not entirely. I suspect it emanates from there. So I do think a lot of the sort of what you might refer to as bad bureaucracy does seem to be generated from the state and or legal decisions which would seemingly be in contradiction to general libertarian legal theory. That would seem to be the case. Nevertheless, insofar as you have large organizations and you're trying to coordinate people, you're probably going to have these sorts of these rules that feel bureaucratic. And I don't think you can avoid it if you have a technological society. That said, to the extent that, so I think the question that arises really, if a technological society requires substantially large organizations, then you're probably going to get what I've defined as bureaucracy to a large extent. If it's smaller organization, you'll have less of it because you can have more direct control and have sort of more agency as an individual, typically, in those situations. But I do think that the current rules that have at the moment, you can refer to as sort of like bad bureaucracy, because you just have these absurd legal requirements that you need to follow. Now, granted, I'll give you one example I think is absurd. I've never come across a good defense of this. To get a license to sell commercial food, you need to have a dedicated hand washing basin in your place, your kitchen, and a pot washing basin separately. And I keep thinking, but I don't have that at home. I haven't got food poisoning, so what's the problem? But to get a license from it, you need that. Now, you could argue that, well, though in Ancapistan, if you wanted insurance, then the insurance company would require it in a way like the council requires of you. But even if that was true, well, there's two things. One is, well, do you even need insurance? I'm pretty sure insurance is like a legal requirement for certain things. So you could just not have it. If you didn't have that legal requirement, then of course there'd be an out there. And secondly, even if you didn't need insurance, if you want to be part of like the good bakery scheme, and they said that, oh yeah, the places that sell who are with on our umbrella are certified of having good food hygiene practices, you could then of course always have someone just selling, well, I'm not part of any, do you want to buy it? Oh, it looks nice, great. So you always have that kind of out. So that, I think that would always be a valve an outlet valve, which would sort of temper that. Now then, of course, if you had some like private city, you could argue the private city would do that, and then you get more of a land question. Can you really have these competing areas and whatever if someone's not monopolizing the zone, as it were, where people are to sell it? But that's my sort of general thinking of how sort of good or bad bureaucracy might happen in any form of technological society.
Your statement was a lot of the asinine or idiotic rules originate from the state. Is that correct? Regarding insurance with them, is that correct?
Oh, yes. I think, and also some certain legal cases where the duty of care one has been really expansive since it was developed as a doctrine. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say the question before then is, why do states exist? And is the state a bumbling, inept fool? Or is the state, as Augustine would describe it, or Rothbard described it, as like a rapacious gang of some variety? Because it seems like some of your it's just duty of care, blah 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 blah. I think this also sort of shows up in our abortion debates, or I either think two insane things about abortion, but I think there's but none. That's an aside. But no, actually not entirely. But yes, well, why are there states in the beginning? Well, people want states. Well, people claim to want states. Now, the Marxists, anarchists, and libertarians will decide, well, and Hoppe talks about the libertarian class consciousness. We need to change the ideological substructure. Why do people want states? Why do intellectuals, like Mises too, want? Why do we need this rapacious gang, which spits out these rules? Why do we need this? Because either it just exists and we need to overthrow it. Okay, but why can't we overthrow it? Well, one of the reasons seemingly we can't overthrow it is ideology, or it could be a necessary organization. And we talked to Rick Story, or we talked to some people, they seem to think it's a necessary organization. You and I think it might not be a necessary organization, but the problem with people like me, as I understand it, is once I identify, the guy who ran to make people under 18 unable to work, you have to ask why was he doing it? You have to ask that question. You have to ask, why was he doing it? You have to assume that he's a human actor, in the Misesian sense. He's a human actor. He's going to make actions. He's going to think about them. He's not just an instinctual animal. So why? Well, I would argue that he's engaging in. You could argue, a la Socrates, that he's just really empathetic, and he just wants people under 18 to have a glorious, innocent childhood. So therefore, they shouldn't work. And he also thinks that workplaces are dangerous, and you could get cancer, or you could, they're enslaving. So he's just got the glorious. Or you could also argue that he wants to raise the cost of having children because he thinks there are too many people. He wants to, put a legal burden on poor people or middle class people so they can't have their children working. You could also. So why does that guy have power? Well, he probably ran for office or had political power. So I think the problem to the extent that rotten rules exist and are enforced, like, it goes back to the origin of the state question. Like, if you're going to say they originate from the state, well, then why does the state still exist? Why does the state continue to exist? Why do people trust the state? Because that's who they go. That's who, like with COVID, for example. If I'd asked, I was at a museum in Atlanta, and I asked the guy, why are you obeying this rule about forcing masks? I first of all point out that the guy out front didn't have a mask when I went by him because I didn't have a mask. He clearly didn't want to wear it. It's like, well, why are you obeying this law? And he said, well, the government's obeying the law. If you ask the government's obeying the law, the government will claim it's obeying the law because the people want the COVID mask restrictions. Some people in the government will say that. Some people, not all, but people want this. You couldn't go back to work. But then you have to ask, why was there a big giant fear in the first place? Well, it was the media. And it was like, well, if you dig deep enough down, it comes, well, at some point, there was some sort of like MK Ultra propaganda programming that was implemented by the media that everyone bought into. And obviously, a huge percent of people just went berserk. I mean, if you watch cable news, like in United States, and you believed it, you would go berserk if you were in COVID, and like, you would think everyone is a zombie apocalypse out there. So like, you know, I don't mean the guy to blame the media but like, you know, your question was these asinine rules originate from the state. And you asked that, well, some of these asinine rules originate because people ran for office to deal with quote unquote panics, rightly or wrongly, deal with what they perceive to be panics. So that'd be my long-winded response to your question. Like there's a way in which normal human behavior, you don't need. There's lots of instances where people don't sue, which they could sue, for example, or they don't solve crimes even if they could sue. But like I would argue a lot of things about like the whole forcing property owners after they got robbed to further, like that's just because your ruling class hates you. That's not an error of bureaucracy. That's the bureaucracy working. I mean, you know, that'd be my position. It's not that the bureaucracy they want, you know, they have like, I don't know, white guilt or something. They like, you know, or something like that, and that he's like, you know, you're gonna force you to help that. Like, I don't know, that'd be my position. I don't think that's ineptitude. I think that's. But like, how do you solve that problem? Well, I don't know. I mean, even talking about what you're saying, if you said it publicly on Facebook at this point, you probably would be. But that'd be my position. Like you know, that'd be my pushback. No one criticizes the fact that like you can send a package from here to Los Angeles in 24 hours. Again, you could say we shouldn't be able to do that. You know, you go full folksy on that. But like, or the fact that we're having this conversation through transatlantic cables or satellites. I'm not sure exactly the mechanics works, but it's kind of amazing. This conversation couldn't have happened before 1960. And people complain about the lack there of customer service today, but there was never customer service. Like before, and the reason I know this is because you people couldn't spend $8 a minute on phone bills before 1960 anyway. There was no cell phones. I mean, there was no phones before a certain period of time. So that's just another thing. Like you couldn't even call the cable company. The cable company wouldn't exist. So that'd be my position. I think a lot of the things you're identifying are supposed to happen, and if they're not supposed to happen, they might be able to be fixed, or they might not be able to be fixed. Like cable is a problem in the sense that like it goes through many different people's properties. It has all sorts of weird legal things on it. You know. I mean, you could argue that, you know, like just have cell phone, like just have, you know, things like that. But even there, you have to have like, I mean, but I'm going on a side here. Is the state a bumbling fool, or is the state a rapacious gang? If the state's a rapacious gang, and these rules originate from a rapacious gang, I mean, as Hans Hoppe would describe, the state is not a normal firm in the way that like a restaurant is a normal firm. You know. But that'd be my position. It's a promotion of bads, as Hoppe would say. But that's a moral term, and you say it out. You're just trying to describe it neutrally. But I think that's hard to do. That'd be my response.
I suppose the motivation I had was to think, well, okay, let's try and take what would be, you might think, the best case of a technological society, and then think, okay, is Ted K's position correct? Also, as well, thinking as well, when he talks about the power process, about how an individual basically needs to strive to achieve a goal that is sort of meaningful and have power to be able to achieve it, and then that's a good sort of sense of psychological well-being, which is similar to the guy you didn't particularly like because the interview didn't start properly, Arthur Brooks. I'm pretty sure, I can't remember exactly, he says something like, one element of happiness is satisfaction. You need to be able to strive to achieve goals and sort of have the ability to achieve them. And so I was thinking also that, with the Bureau, if it is the case that the higher the technological society, the more control there is over any individual sort of action, then that sort of prevents the power process taking place, and therefore would contribute to people feeling that they are victims and lack agency. As an aside on a different topic, it does seem to be the case that those people who have sort of victim status believe themselves to have almost no agency. Otherwise, they would have victim status. And then the question arises is, to what extent does a technological society provide the conditions for this sort of helplessness? Now, granted, I think that's largely economic and regulatory and stuff from the state. Although you might say that, of course, I'm going to say that. But as I described, I think in the technological society, that is a non-sort of heavy statist one, the rules generated are going to be less bad. And secondly, there's going to be more outs on the rules than there currently are. You would be able to sell stuff without a license, without any sort of recognition from anybody else. And secondly, the types of regulation that these sort of organizations demand from the members is likely to be less.
With the whole example in the current existing societies with it, do you think with if you have a hole and you get robbed and someone trips in the hole and they sue you for harm, do you think that rule exists because this, like, to me, that rule exists because the rulers hate you, like individually, but or collectively, they kind of like hate you. They view you as like chattel that they want to milk, in a sense, in a way, like that would be why those rules exist. They don't exist as air quote normal laws. They exist as the promotion of bads. Like, that's Hoppe's position also, too. Do you agree, or do you think those rules just exist because bumbling foolishness? Like, if I forget my keys, if I drop my keys, for example, that's a bumbling fool move. But if I walk up and take your keys, and if someone purposely hides my keys in a place where I can't find them or not likely to find them, that's the reason I couldn't find my keys is not because I was a fool. It's because someone purposely did something to make my life difficult. And maybe that's not capital C crime in the same way that, like, but it's not. And the question is, how do you prevent that? Because, like, if you understand it as me and Hoppe would understand it, you'd have to, like, well, how do you stop people from harming each other? But the way they're harming you is by not allowing you to defend yourself. And if you do defend yourself, they'll say you're going after other people. But that'd be my point. Like, why do those rules exist?
I would say both. I mean, there might be with the judges at the time, I don't know, but I could see why. I can kind of see why I can kind of see why you might have a duty of care. I think it's a terrible idea. I can understand what it does it, but I think it's been weaponized. And also, as well, I think a lot of it, I think a lot of it's down to lawyers wanting to make money and be able to have more cases that they can prosecute. It does seem to be the case that what you tend to find is a lot of people going to politics have got like a law background. So Keir Starmer was director of public prosecutions in England, in the UK. Tony Blair was a barrister, I think, or some form of lawyer. You have this, and they very much seem to be in control with that. But one of the things I was going to do before I forget, I think one aspect that Ted K doesn't mention, although I think Ted K would probably be, Ted K sounds like he'd be pretty based on this kind of stuff, is I think one of the reasons why you have a lot of these rules in the formal sense, now you could say what I'm referring to here is unwritten ones, is common culture. Now you could argue, so if you have a relatively homogeneous society, you don't need as longer contracts because everyone kind of knows what the rules are, which kind of feels smoother and less bureaucratic rather than having massive contracts drawn up. Now, that is a temperamental thing. There was an interesting book read out by Neva Parvini, academic agent on his YouTube channel, which was something like National Cultures. And it was a French guy from the 1950s writing about the temperaments and general personality type of the peoples of Europe. And mentioned this, the French were kind of like, no, we need to write everything down. We need everything to be kind of written, these long contracts, everything's covered. And he said, like, the Anglo was like, didn't really write much down. He just kind of thought it was an agreement, and so they should keep to the agreement, and it was all kind of like unwritten. And I suppose this is to some extent a different mindset towards, say, things like a civil or common law system. But I do think to have that kind of unwritten sort of everything just on gentleman agreement type stuff really very heavily depends upon having a common culture, a shared set of values, and which would, at least in most cases, correlate with a relatively ethnically homogeneous society. Then again, you could say that, well, in a technological society, that's not possible to achieve. Although, interestingly, this then goes into the whole brick card thing, which you've mentioned. And we've discussed this on Prime Private a bit, is in a free society, would you need to have some sort of identity card of something to say that you are actually a part of this sort of micro state or micro community? Otherwise, how would they be able to determine who's in and who's out? Or at least at the border have to do that. Otherwise, how would you be able to show that you are sort of legally resident? And I suppose that's another aspect of the bureaucratization, whatever, I don't know the good term of it. What do you think of that? You've mentioned it before, and I do think it's relevant. Tim, you've voiced of skepticism of the idea that, oh no, we couldn't have any ID systems at all because it simply wouldn't work in like a society where you have hypermobility.
In a society where you have hypermobility, I think if you want borders in a society with hypermobility, you would need to have some sort of way to know that the friend-enemy distinction. Like the sort of open border libertarians will make these kind of arguments. And then I'll see like the sort of like, not MAGA types, but like I'm not so using this word, well, maybe you'll interpret this way, but like your types who are, many of your Facebook friends are critical of these digital IDs, which I am too. I don't think they're being used in virtuous manners. I don't think they will be used in a virtuous manner. But like, if you want, like you could say we should control migration by stopping boats coming from or whatever. Okay, fine. But like, if you understand it as cartels, like, well, why can't they just fly across on airplanes? Well, I mean, I think they would try to do that if they could, by the way. Like, if you got rid of, they probably would just show up on cruise ships, and like, if they could just get on and you couldn't shoot them or whatever, and they were willing to pay. I mean, I'm sure they'd be more willing to pay than you have a cartel do it, probably, if they could just pay, you know. So you would need some sort. Now, again, I'm not sitting here defending the TSA or the current existing Border Patrol. But people like Keith would point out that you know, and Whitney Webb, like a lot of the things that like Palantir are using to control migration will be just used to control domestic extremism, aka you know who, in like 6 years probably, and it probably already there's lots of continuity. There's probably already are. Um, um, so like when it comes to ideas, I I don't. I mean, like when I say empirically, I think the case is correct. I would just say like like is am I defending IDs? I don't know. I mean, how do you have like you could say well my community won't be involved in international financing, won't be involved in international trade to high level, so we'll just know everybody and we'll just build a wall and keep the people out. Okay, I'm not like again I'm not against people doing that. By the way, I think you should be perfectly willing to do that. The problem is like if you if you first of all the British state would be your first enemy if you tried to set this up in Britain. Britain would say, well, you have a duty to let people through this community or whatever. The British state would be the first enemy. Um, and then other mega corporations might be an enemy because they might want to open up things inside that community and so forth. Um, um, so like you can try to have breakaway you know communities that great, but then who's your enemies to doing that? It's not the Chinese, it's not the Russians, it's the current existing British state. Um, um, so and you'd have to be kind of low technology. I mean, I you said suppose such and such exists. I think the problem with that word is suppose. Suppose a pure libertarian order exists. I think the problem with that word is suppose. Now, I still think it could exist. I still think a libertarian society could exist. I don't think it's the reason I think it could exist is because I think the current world was unlikely to happen, yet happened. Maybe I'm talking like an open theist here, but the current world was unlikely to happen, but did happen. So I think we could imagine a slightly different way that things could happen. That it could be the case that you could have these roles that originate quote unquote privately. Um, um, and I think that could improve things. Um, I think that could improve things if you can construct the rules in such a way that they weren't just constructed by like either rapacious criminals or know nothings of the kind. Um, like the AOC, like AOC is just the like why does she have political power? Like if you ask someone from the 1750 in New York, a Dutch person in 1700, and said in 300 years this will be your political representative, they might laugh here. Like they might laugh. But like she doesn't really have it. People are right. She doesn't really have that much capital P political power anyway. But I the fact that our current existence is absurd might mean that we could actually make it less absurd. But I don't know how to do that either. I don't know how to do that. But I will point out what I see as the contradictions of the quote unquote resistance positions when they don't align. And again, you maybe could accuse me of carrying water for the regime, but you could also say people who imply that keep Britain British are also. I mean, that's what Keith Preston and Whitney Webb and Glenn Green would all tell you, is that if you want to keep Britain British, the only way to do that would be to have a bunch of tyrannical rules. So maybe you shouldn't want to keep that. So that's my position on ID is like it's not like Britain is a monoethnic society anymore. I mean, unfortunately or fortunately, whatever your position on that is, unfortunately. But then how do you go back to that position in a quote unquote libertarian manner, or remotely civil libertarian, or even like legal manner? And again, maybe there's simple ways to do that or not to do that. I don't know. I used to have a blog called "Is Freedom Possible?" or "Is Liberty Possible?" And I still basically hold that question: Is liberty possible? Is it possible for people to actually be free in a meaningful manner, not in a non-meaningful manner. I would say Ted Kaczynski, he's just a conventional leftist in some ways. On my critical reading, or just say he's a conventional leftist. Like he makes the point that advertisers will create desires in people that their grandparents wouldn't dream of, so that they go to work for corporations that are hierarchical. And it's like that's great, Ted, but like, what else are people supposed to do? In a very like, and he's also fetishizing the freedom of like primitivist people, too. Like it's not like your Cherokee or your Sioux hunter in an idealized manner was quote unquote free. As people point out, that the Aztecs and Incas were on the road to becoming empires that probably would have killed them anyway. I mean, it's entirely logical that the Incas created their own civilization in South America that rivaled Rome. It's not totally logical, and it's not like, so like, the institutions of there show up in other places. So, like, I think he's fetishizing the freedom of primitivist people in a way. So that'd be my final position on the topic. Is, you asked me about IDs. I of course I'm opposed to IDs, but then, like, how do you, like, you said, well, you can use passports in our private messages. You said, well, then you can use things already exist. You don't need a new thing, and that's true. But the consistent position, the kook libertarian position, would be to be opposed to those things too. And so I would say you have to be consistent too. Is if you're opposed to like telling anyone where you live, and list of things like, how do you know, other than a vouching system, which is fine. That's fine. That kind of personal system is fine. But like, how do you make that personal system work in a society bigger than 100 people or so? I don't know how you make that kind of personalized system work. And that goes back to like the workplace democracy problem too. So that's my final comment. Thanks for doing this episode, Swiftly. Very interesting. But I don't really have any more to say.
I think when it comes to ID, I do think you're definitely going to need some form of ID, but it could just be a name, an address type thing, and it wouldn't need to be linked to anything. So I don't think that's necessarily that bad. I mean, if you go to a private members club, you've got to be on the database. You've got to have a membership card. Like, you could just have a membership card for a community, and that's it. You don't need to have, for instance, police coming around, papers please, do you have rights to be here? It would seem to be a much simpler thing. Well, I suppose a community could do that insofar as there's a lot of problems, but I'd expect most of the effort will be put in the border areas, at least, or something like that, where you can just check. That would be, I mean, in the case of, for instance, a nation state, and that's relatively easy. When you're microstates, you could argue you've got papers please all the time. But in a nation state, I mean, you just need to do it at the borders, because that's the only place, because that would be the most efficient way of enforcing it. So I actually think the really anti-ID people don't really think through, I don't think, how a sophisticated technological society could operate. But thanks for doing this. Now I'd like to thank everyone for listening. If you'd enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.